This week on Quadriga, Russia and the West. Time to mend fences? It was a small conciliatory gesture. On Sunday, German Chancellor Angela Merkel visited the Russian president in Moscow to lay a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier. Both said they wanted to reach a diplomatic solution to the Ukraine conflict. 2 days later, the US Secretary of State visited Russia for the first direct talks with Putin in 2 years. Among the topics on the agenda were the conflicts in Ukraine, Syria and Yemen. Could this mark the end of the big freeze between Russia and the West? Coming to you from Berlin, Quadriga. Your host this week is Melinda Crane.
Hello and welcome to Quadriga. Is the chance of a diplomatic solution any stronger than it has been in recent months? And what is the situation in eastern Ukraine? Those are just two of the issues we want to talk about today with three people who've been following events in Ukraine very closely. It's my pleasure to welcome Alan Posner. He was born in London, grew up in Kuala Lumpur and Berlin, has authored numerous books and is a regular commentator for the German newspaper Die Welt. He says, when Russia ends its aggression in the Ukraine, returns the territory it stole from Georgia and Moldova, and stops supporting Syria and Iran, we can start mending fences. Until then, Cold War is inevitable, and the West will win again, only quicker this time. And it's a pleasure to welcome Moritz Gathmann. He's been reporting on the former Soviet Union for over 10 years and covering the Ukrainian crisis for the German news magazine Spiegel and other media. He's also written for Russian state-funded Russia Beyond the Headlines. And he says relations between the West and Russia are cracked but not broken. There have been signs over the last weeks that the West and Russia could get back to pragmatic relations. And our third guest on the program, Lucian Kim. He's a Berlin-based journalist who writes about the Ukraine conflict for Slate, Reuters, and other media. He previously worked as a correspondent for Bloomberg News in Moscow. And his statement, there's a huge temptation for the West to forget about Ukraine and go back to business as usual with Russia. Alan Posner, clearly you do not advocate a return to business as usual. That was quite a long and hefty list of conditions that you would impose for any return to normalcy. But don't we need to work with Russia on Syria, on Iran, the reasons that Secretary of State Kerry just went to Moscow?
Well, yes, we would like to be able to work together with the Russians, but look at Iran. What has Russia done? The deal has hardly been... I mean, the ink on the deal with Iran about its nuclear capabilities had hardly been dried when Russia sells them or delivers the already sold anti-aircraft missiles that Iran needs to protect its nuclear capabilities. Look at Syria. There was talk, or the Russians said that they had convinced Mr. Assad to give up his chemical weapons. We've seen Assad using chemical weapons only 2 weeks ago against his own people. And then look at the Ukraine, where everyone's talking about the Minsk agreement and this and that and the other, but where Russia still denies the fact that everyone knows that its troops are there on the ground, amassing heavy equipment, for an attack on Mariupol. So what? And I haven't even started to talk about Georgia. So, I mean, why should anyone think that an agreement is mending fences on the table? They've pushed their fences closer to us, and we're supposed to mend them for them? No, thank you.
Lucian Kim, to what degree do you think Russia really wants to work with the West? Yes, Vladimir Putin had a few somewhat nice things to say about cooperation during Chancellor Merkel's visit, but on the day before, when Russia was celebrating the 70th anniversary of the victory over Nazi Germany, you might have thought it was still at war. The rhetoric was very, very hard indeed. So do you see any real change in Russian actions?
I don't know about changes in Russian action, but to go back to your question about whether Russia wants to work with the West, I think Putin differentiates. I think he's more or less written off the United States as any kind of partner to work with. But as far as Europe is concerned, he's very interested in resurrecting the relations, in having the sanctions lifted, and really going back to business as usual, to going back to the same cooperation that there was before the Ukraine conflict.
But what is he concretely doing to make that happen, Moritz Gathmann? You say pragmatic relations there are signs of rapprochement, but where are they? Clearly, Alan Posner doesn't see any.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you go back to the case of Ukraine, you can clearly see that over the last 2-3 months, there hasn't been any big escalation of the conflict. There are practically 2-3 places where there is still some shooting going on. But actually, the real war that we had until January, February, with really heavy fighting, it stopped in February. And although none of the sides is really satisfied with that status quo that we have now, there are signs from both sides, from Ukraine and from the separatists, that they are searching for a way to solve the problem, to find a solution. There was just an initiative yesterday by the separatists who made a proposition to the Ukrainian parliament for amendments in certain laws concerning their territories. And I would say that it's not a big step, but it's a good proposition. And the main thing is that in this proposition, these territories stay as a part of Ukraine, and they accept that they will be part of Ukraine, at least concerning these propositions. So there are certain signs in Ukraine, at least, that the sides are trying to find a solution to the problem.
I want to take a look at the situation in Ukraine in just a moment, but let's first listen to what the Chancellor did have to say when she met with Mr. Putin.
Because of the criminal annexation of Crimea, which violates international law, and the military conflict in eastern Ukraine, our cooperation has suffered a serious setback. I say serious, as we see it as a violation of the principles of the common European political system for peace. Criminal annexation of Crimea. Those are quite strong words, Lucian Kim. You said in your statement that you were worried that the West was ready to return to business as usual. It doesn't sound like that if you listen to the Chancellor.
I was very surprised when I heard Chancellor Merkel use the word criminal. What's interesting is in the official transcript that appeared later in the Kremlin website, that word was missing. I think Chancellor Merkel has shown a very strong stance towards Russia regarding Ukraine. But what we do see is a general loosening. I think people are unhappy with the status quo of this frozen relationship, not only in Ukraine but also between the West and Russia. And of course,
which people exactly?
Well, what I wanted to say was, I mean, we just saw Secretary Kerry also visiting Putin, which was also from a Russian point of view was certainly a breakthrough. So I think there is an attempt by the Russians also to sort of to warm up relations, to tone down the rhetoric. And I think what's going on in eastern Ukraine, I mean, the separatists are clearly proxies of the Kremlin. And so certain initiatives which they voice, well, I don't know how seriously we can take them. I mean, often these are done for propaganda reasons so that later the Russians and their proxies can claim that, well, we made all these proposals and Kiev rejected them. So I would be very careful in taking those proposals too seriously.
Alan?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, people are talking, but they're not doing anything, right? They're not doing anything. We have to think about what is Putin's game plan. His game plan is short-term to bring the sanctions down because they're really hurting Russia. His game plan, medium-term, is to break up the European Union, to split it into people like Greece, Cyprus, possibly Hungary, Bulgaria, who would be allies of Russia, and others like Britain, Germany, and so on, possibly France, who would stay with the United States. So these, and then long-term, to really undermine the whole structure of Europe. Unless we take that seriously, unless we realize that Putin has a game plan, we're going to misread the signs. So, of course, he's telling his proxies, as you say, in eastern Ukraine, tone down the rhetoric, don't attack, move into strategic positions so that he can get the sanctions relieved. But he hasn't given up any of his long-term game plans because of that, and they're going to make any long-term rapprochement impossible.
How much are the sanctions really hurting Russia, Moritz Gathmann? At the moment, the oil price is actually going back up. The ruble seems to have stabilized. Mightn't Putin actually be feeling somewhat better now than he was a few months ago?
He surely does. And what you saw at the end of last year, when the ruble was, well, you could get 90 rubles for €1. Now it's about 55 rubles for €1. If you compare it to the end of last year, it was at that time really everybody thought that Russia in 3 months or 6 months may collapse. What you see now is really that the situation improved, and of course Putin can use this in the rhetoric, in his propaganda to his own people that look like we didn't get crushed. They tried hard, but we are still there. And I mean, people in Russia, they are not starving. Of course, there are some problems coming with these sanctions, but I mean, I really think that the thing that mostly concerned the people was the currency exchange rate of the ruble. If it had really crashed like it did in '98, there would have been huge dissatisfaction in Russia. But Russia actually managed to...
But in that case, and given that his popularity ratings remain very, very high indeed, why would he have an incentive to move toward more pragmatic relations, as you said in your opening statement?
Well, he does understand that in the long run, there has to be, again, more... There have to be more pragmatic relations. There has to be cooperation with the West, because it's all this struggle now. It's very short range. But of course, Russia needs good pragmatic relations, political and economic relations with the West, and people in Russia, and they do understand this.
If I could just jump in, I mean, Putin is very aware that sanctions are coming up for renewal in June, the EU sanctions. So this would be a good moment to tone down the rhetoric, not to provoke any...
Well, that sounds like the game plan.
...uptick. Well, I would debate whether he has exactly the grand scheme that Alan was laying out, but he certainly is using, for example, Chinks in the EU to sort of separate one country from, to break up the unity and
divide and conquer.
Exactly, but I think it's for the short-term goal of of getting rid of the sanctions. I don't think he's a very far-sighted leader. I think what's important for Putin in Ukraine is creating a Ukraine where he has leverage. Right now, with the status quo now, it actually suits him fine. He doesn't need fighting. He doesn't need. He controls a small piece of the territory that the Ukrainians, whatever they do, cannot get rid of this Russian-occupied area, and that's about all he needs.
Alan Posner, chinks between the different EU countries and also perhaps Europe and the U.S. How big are those chinks that Lucian Kim just referred to as possibly offering Putin opportunities to divide and conquer?
Well, they're pretty big. I mean, if you think of Greece, when Tsipras went, the Greek Prime Minister, newly elected, went to Moscow in the hope of getting cheap money from Moscow to pay his debts to the so-called Troika, among them the European Union. That was an example of a chink. He didn't get what he wanted, but he did get, he was allowed to export, Greek agricultural products to Russia, which was an attempt sort of to get leverage against the sanctions regime of the European Union. Then if you think there's this whole idea of the unity of the Orthodox churches. There's Serbia there, which isn't in the European Union, but is a candidate. There's Bulgaria, there's Hungary, which can be used against the European Union. There's this whole... and then there's the distrust between certain members of the European Union and the United States due to the NSA affair, things like that. So he's got a whole lot of things balls that he can juggle with, and he's juggling quite well.
But so far, they have stayed pretty unified, Moritz Gathmann, and the Chancellor clearly has made a big push to keep everybody on the same track. Are you as doubtful as the other two guests about the likelihood that sanctions, that the West can hold the sanctions regime together?
Well, I think that actually the sanctions are explain why at this point it is quite easy for Russia to juggle with these balls, because if you take Greece, for them, the agricultural export to Russia plays a quite important role. So there are some countries in the European Union who are clearly unhappy with these sanctions. These countries, they are not totally against the sanctions, but they would say if there is an improvement over the next months in the situation in Ukraine, they would certainly say that, okay, we can loosen the sanctions.
Well, that's exactly what John Kerry said in his visit. He said that if the Minsk agreement is fully implemented, the sanctions will be lifted. And I think in Kiev, that created a lot of concern, because it's as if everyone forgot that Crimea was annexed. Some of the sanctions were first implemented because of the annexation of Crimea. So there's a lot of worry and concern in Kiev. I was just there, that the West will simply recognize de facto the annexation of Crimea.
So let's take a look at the situation in eastern Ukraine, specifically in Donetsk. Both Chancellor Merkel and President Putin admitted during their meeting that the ceasefire is definitely flawed. Let's take a look at what our teams are reporting.
In the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic in eastern Ukraine, residents have also been marking the 70th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. Here, war is no distant memory, but part of everyday life. Despite the ceasefire agreed in Minsk in February, fighting flares up regularly. The UN estimates that more than 6,000 people have been killed in the conflict up to now. Industrial production in the Donbas region has also been hard hit. Average income here amounts to around €80 a month. Many people rely on charity. Everything is in short supply. In particular, medicines and sanitary products are running low. Ukraine restricts the entry of people and goods to the areas controlled by the separatists. Around half of the population of Donetsk is estimated to have fled the city.
Lucian Kim, I know that you have traveled in the region fairly extensively. What have you seen on your most recent trips, and what are you hearing from your sources there?
Well, it's of course the biggest question facing Ukraine is what to do with these separatist republics, and it's a real dilemma. I mean, Kiev has, as was also mentioned in the clip, has cut off a lot of the pensions and social support for the people living there. On one hand, they say, well, we can't support them because it's a separatist region. On the other hand, how can they claim that these are their citizens if they're not going to support them? So it's a real dilemma how to go about, keeping them and sort of punishing the separatists at the same time. And there's a lot of debate. Is this status quo? Is this really what the Ukrainians want? There's certainly a hard line that says we need to go in, we need to liberate our regions from Russian occupation. But of course, more realistic and cooler heads know that that is simply impossible as long as those regions have the support of the Russian military. There's absolutely no way that Ukraine will get them back.
Moritz Gathmann, I think you have referred to the conflict you wrote a couple of months ago as essentially a dead and frozen conflict. So you would expect it to stay exactly the way it is?
Well, the biggest problem, I would really say that mainly at this moment, it is a quite frozen conflict. There is no bigger escalation and no point of the front line at this point. But the problem is that economically, these separatist republics, with this status quo being blocked by the Ukrainians economically, they cannot survive. But they also can't be fed by Russia, because Russia doesn't have this money for 2 million people. And
but economic considerations have never seemed to play a particularly dominant role in Vladimir Putin's calculations.
Well, Russia was economically stronger 2-3 years ago. I think Russia understood that it can feed some people in Abkhazia and southern Ossetia, but this Donbas region, it's really too big, and Russia has Crimea to feed. So Russia is not interested in feeding a whole industrial region, and Russia is not interested in this region to become a totally depressed, impoverished area. That's why the conflict is quite frozen at this point, but the status quo is not acceptable for the people living there.
You know, I really don't think that, as Melinda was saying, that Mr. Putin really cares about how the people are and, you know, what happens there, as long as the power of his clique is not challenged. And he's immensely popular for what he's doing and what he did in the Ukraine. 80% of the Russians think this is great. He's restoring the empire. And they're obviously prepared to take a whole lot of hardships in consequence. And apparently, I mean, who cares in the Kremlin whether the people are starving in eastern Ukraine? He doesn't really care. So,
but there is a perspective in these regions. I have been there 3 weeks ago to the Donbas region. If the people there, they had a quite normal life before all this. You know, Donetsk is a quite nice city. They have big football stadium. They have cinemas and everything. It looks quite European in some places. So the people know how life was, you know. And if they, in 1 year or in 2 years, don't see any improvement, there could actually be a rebellion in this region against these Kremlin-supported separatist leaders, and people could go to Kiev and say, take us back. And this is what Putin can't accept.
But Lucian Kim just told us he's not sure that Putin works with a big game plan, with a long-term strategy, that perhaps it's more about opportunism and making the most of whatever situation you have right now. Wouldn't that argue against the elements that you've just listed having any actual effect on his political behavior?
Well, it's what I am talking about is all quite short-term plans. I mean, what I was talking about, this could happen in 5 months. It could happen in 1 year. So I would say that Putin, that's the terms that Putin is planning with 1 year, 2 years, 3 years.
And Putin is not politically accountable to those people. So he can always portray as this is a reason, this is a consequence of an economic blockade by Kiev.
Yes.
So it can always be turned against Ukraine, which, after all, claims its territory. So,
okay, but I would say, I just talked a lot to the people there, that in November, December, people were really very angry at Kiev, because that was the time when Kiev cut off the territories. But now, half a year later, people sort of have forgotten about this. They say, yeah, that was bad from the side of Kiev, but they're also very unsatisfied already with their separatist leaders, who tell them that life will be great in Donbas. We are a big industrial region, but people understand that all the shops are closed. There can't be any real economy without cooperation with Ukraine.
I think we also need to take a step back. The people in the Donbas region, they were never really separatists. They didn't necessarily want to break off from Ukraine. What they thought was that they could follow the Crimean, and achieve independence, right? This idea of these small independent republics is a Kremlin creation. What the people did support, they were unhappy about the political changes that took place in Kiev. That's undoubtable. But what they thought was, if they vote in a referendum, even if it's kind of a quasi-referendum, as long as they vote for this autonomy from Kiev, that they will be annexed in the same way as Crimea. That was their goal. And so,
but that means that they are separatists, doesn't it?
Yes, but they didn't want. Their goal was not achieving independence. It wasn't like some kind of Donetsk liberation movement. This is just a complete fiction.
Yeah, but to separate from Ukraine.
Separate and join Russia. I mean, I think this is, and I think so. I think there's a certain disappointment now. Well, you know, we didn't join Russia, and now we're run by a bunch of crooks.
I'd like to come back to Russia's role in the whole thing. You've said you think that this could stay sort of half frozen, at least for a while, and at least until dissatisfaction builds in Donetsk. And Lucian Kim said something more or less along the same lines. The U.S. State Department said late last month that Russia is continuing to violate the ceasefire accord and shipping heavy weapons to the separatists. And the defense secretary in the U.S. said last week that Russian-backed separatists in eastern Ukraine are preparing for another round of military action. That doesn't sound very half-frozen. That sounds like it could get quite hot again, Alan Posner.
Well, I'm not an expert. I haven't been there like Lucian has, and so I don't know. But I mean, I assume that the State Department has its sources, and I've heard on BBC a report from round about Mariupol where it didn't sound much like the conflict was frozen. Sounded like the conflict was pretty hot. So, but whatever happens, I mean. They're waiting for what happens in the sanctions on the sanctions front. If the EU resumes the sanctions, renews the sanctions, they're going to attack militarily. If they don't renew the sanctions, there's going to be a small breathing space, and then they're going to attack later. But this is not going to go away. This is much too good for Mr. Putin. He has an enemy, the fascists in Kiev, supported by the West, which doesn't want to give Russia its place in the sun. Why would he want to come to terms with us, to come, and get rid of his main asset, which is an enemy? That's what every band of crooks, as you called them, and the people who are ruling in the Kremlin know better. That's what they all need. And so it's much too good for him. He's not going to come to the sort of, to be all friendly the way Boris Yeltsin was. No, it's not going to happen.
Lucian Kim, you wanted to respond.
Well, I just wanted to say that I don't think there's really a contradiction with this arms buildup going on in eastern Ukraine. I mean, it creates so much uncertainty. Do we know what's going to happen? No, we don't. We don't know if there's going to be an attack. But just this threat, and this threat on the town of Mariupol and across this ceasefire line, which is very shaky, makes it very difficult for anyone to really think much farther. And I mean, the tragedy of this is that it really it prevents Ukraine from moving forward. The government in Kiev is really has said that it wants to push a reform agenda, and who is going to lend money to this kind of country, and who is going to invest? I mean, Ukraine really needs foreign investment right now, and in this kind of situation where we don't know if it's war or peace or somewhere in between, it derails any reform project in Ukraine almost from the start. And I would argue that is really what Putin is aiming for.
Moritz Gathmann, to those two quotes that I just gave from the Secretary of State in the U.S. and the Defense Secretary, both saying that they see signs that Russia is still backing the separatists and is preparing for a new escalation, perhaps along the terms that Alan Posner laid out. Would you agree with that? Did you see signs of that?
Well, there is still fighting going on in the south of the Donbas region, but it's very local fighting practically around one village not far away from Mariupol. But I think that this threat to Mariupol, it is part of the game on both sides. Russia wants to show we could, if we wanted to, and the West is reacting in the same way. They say, no, don't do it. But I'm very critical about the real perspective that Russia would, or the separatists together with Russia would attack Mariupol, because it's it's a big city, and taking a big city is not as easy as fighting in the field, And actually, if Russia and the separatists took Mariupol, there would be very bad pictures of and a lot of dead soldiers, because fighting in the city center of Mariupol, it's very difficult. That's why I think really an attack on Mariupol, it's part of the game of threats, but it's not. I wouldn't say that it's realistic.
There is one development, though. We had the first Minsk agreement, which was agreed last September. Then it was renewed in February. And there is one development since February when there was again an uptick in fighting, and when the separatists, even after the signing of the second agreement, went and took the town of Debaltseve. There has been a worrying development that I was hearing about when I was in Kiev, namely that in this period since February, what the Russians have done is they've really started to build an army. Before it was some kind of ragtag group of rebels, and when they were having trouble last summer, the regular Russian army came and rescued them. They did the same thing in Debaltseve. But now, what I'm hearing is that it's becoming more of a formalized army with advisors that will be able to do more of the fighting itself. And I think this was one of the reasons why Mariupol wasn't taken, this very strategic port city, because the separatists were simply too weak. There weren't enough of them, and they were poorly trained and poorly armed. And now they've used this time of the Minsk agreement, of this relative peace, to regroup, rearm, and get some real training.
Proving Russian involvement has, of course, been one of the very, very difficult aspects of this entire conflict. I'd like to take a look at what Secretary of State Kerry had to say when he was in Moscow this week.
The US Secretary of State was obliquely critical of Russia in his remarks about the failure to implement a ceasefire deal in Ukraine.
The continued arming, training, command and control of separate forces. And we believe that this fighting, the fighting that is taking place as a result of this, on any side, whoever has instigated it, that it has gone on for too long.
The Kremlin is also under pressure from allies of murdered opposition politician Boris Nemtsov. They've unveiled a report based on his work. The publication says more than 200 Russian soldiers have been killed in Ukraine. This despite Russia's repeated denials of any participation in the conflict.
Moritz Gathmann, from what Lucian Kim just said, it sounds like we may see a shift away from that very hidden subterfuge using soldiers without insignia towards something even more direct. Do you think that's a real possibility?
Well, what I saw in these separatist republics since last autumn is that it became more centralized. It was really before very chaotic last summer, but all the structures, the state structures, the army, everything became more centralized. And I think they did this in order to make this thing controllable. That's the main issue, I would say. Of course, it's also strategic that Russia doesn't want to use its own soldiers in that region, because that is always risky, and Russia has really lost soldiers in the region.
Now we have the proof. Nemtsov was working on that. Clearly, there is real factual evidence.
That's not new to me. I visited the graves of Russian soldiers in Russia some weeks ago. So what Nemtsov was trying to tell the world, actually, it was nothing new.
It's a compilation. What this report that the opposition presented was a compilation of open... They say it themselves. It was a compilation of open sources. What's interesting is that Nemtsov, Nemtsov, before he was assassinated, was approached by the families of some Russian paratroopers who had died near Debaltseve, because they had been promised compensation and then never received it when their boys didn't return from Ukraine. So that was sort of the exclusive part of that report. But there's nothing otherwise that's very new. The Russian position has always been there's no evidence, prove it. And this is just has been the line actually since Crimea.
So does this going to make any difference?
That specific report will not make any difference.
At least in Russia, it doesn't make any difference. I mean, in Russia, people don't trust a report by Boris Nemtsov. They are controlled by state propaganda, and I mean, and that's the main thing.
Anyone
who wanted in the West, everybody already knows about it. People know that.
And in Russia as well, anyone who wanted that information in Russia already has it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very compact. It's very and they plan. I mean, what the opposition does plan to do is to print several thousand copies and distribute them to people in Russia.
But this is the amazing thing that that we have, as in Soviet times, in fact, even more barefaced than in Soviet times. We have a government lying to its own people, barefacedly. In flying in the face of facts, and their agents and apologists in the West also simply denying it, say, prove it, prove it, prove it. Oh no, there's none there, and we're supposed to take them at face value when they say they want a peaceful solution, they want to adhere to the Minsk agreements, they want to cooperate with the West. The fact is, these people lie all the time. They've completely, the idea of facts and truth and trust has been completely obliterated. So that's the worrying thing.
Moritz Gathmann, the word for this now, the new term is hybrid warfare, the idea that you use soldiers without insignia, you use proxies, and you also use the media with a lot of propaganda, with creating this whole construction of lies that Alan Posner referred to. You did some work with a Russian-funded medium. It was Russia Beyond the Headlines, to be distinguished, of course, from Russia Today. But what was your sense of the degree to which media are becoming part of this equation or are being instrumentalized? Was that a concern for you?
Well, when I worked for that project was very much about what was happening in Russia beyond the headlines. So that is very different from Russia Today. I would say, well, over the last 1.5 years, for myself, I really learned how mighty propaganda can really be. That propaganda can start wars. I would say that the greatest part that the Russian propaganda played, it was in Russia on the one side, but mainly in eastern Ukraine. Because in the heads of the people in eastern Ukraine who watched Russian television, who didn't want to watch Ukrainian television anymore, and at one point they couldn't watch Ukrainian television anymore, they all have these images in their heads of Ukrainian soldiers killing Russian boys, of Ukrainians being Nazis, all the stuff that they get from Russian television. So that Russian television, it really it heated this conflict and it heated it up to war. It made people ready for war. So I wouldn't overemphasize the influence of the Russian propaganda in the West. Yes, there are people who like to see alternative versions of what their state-controlled media is showing, but I wouldn't overemphasize it. But in Russia itself, it plays a very big role, and in eastern Ukraine.
So if I can return to the question that we had at the outset of our program, whether we are likely to see a real rapprochement, if I summarize what I'm hearing more or less from all of you, it is that Putin does not necessarily have a lot of impetus to change anything very substantial about the way that he's been acting. So one last round of questions about the degree to which the West, you've also told me you don't think the West is too keen on keeping that sanctions regime in place. One last aspect about the West's perhaps intentions. Do we need Putin to solve Iran and Syria and other international problems? We heard doubts on that score from Alan at the outset of the program. Do you share them, Lucian Kim?
I think we need Russia to address a whole range of issues, but I think specifically on the issue of Ukraine, we need to support the Ukrainian reformers in their efforts to change their country.
Meaning? Keep sanctions in place?
Well, make them dependent on Russian actions, definitely.
So what are the 2 or 3 things that Russia has to do right now?
Well, one is obviously not inflaming the situation on the ground in eastern Ukraine. Further down the road, would involve a Crimean solution, but that is much farther down the road, and it looks like the West, to be pragmatic, cannot wait that long for Russia to simply give up that territory.
We didn't talk actually about John Kerry, what John Kerry said. He was much less harsh than Angela Merkel when she was in Moscow. The main thing about Kerry was that he didn't talk about Crimea. He said we can start lifting the sanctions if we see over the next months that the Minsk memorandum is implemented.
Right.
This is a softening of the Western harsh stance.
He had far more conditions than Alan Posner did, but the thing is, we haven't actually seen any constructive Russian action on Syria or Iran. So, why?
Well, I'm not a specialist in Syria and Iran, but I'm sure that
but Russian leverage.
Russia has leverage, and Russia is doing everything to be a big player. And if the West isolates Russia and says, no, we don't want to work with you, Russia will do everything to be a menace.
Okay. Many thanks to all of you for being here with us today, and many thanks to all of you out there for tuning in. See you soon.